was at the service. He might come back, boy. So Jesus spoke a lot about scales falling from people's eyes, enabling them to see things they had never seen before. In some cases, he is described as curing people of actual blindness, of people who were blind from birth. But whether blinded from birth or selectively blind, gaining or regaining sight included getting some sort of insight, which presented new horizons to the people who described their new vision as nothing short of a miracle. For instance, the Buddha was granted this ability to see after he fled the confines of his wealthy life in a palace where he was protected from all of the ills that beset his fellow human beings. Once Buddha saw poverty and illness, he became completely transformed into somebody who was completely different. I often wonder whether Jesus had this kind of transformative experience that changed the course of his life. A long time ago, I applied to be the school nurse at Germantown Academy, a prestigious private school in Fort Washington. A friend of mine was a librarian, and I thought I was a shoo-in. I'd get the job, and my 4 children would attend Germantown Academy tuition-free. It was a win-win situation. Well, I didn't get that job, and although I was initially disappointed, it was the best thing that ever happened to me and my children, 3 of whom would have never thrived in that environment. 6 months after GA turned me down, I was working in the school district of Philadelphia in an elementary school that boasted of 76 different ethnic groups, from Afghanistan to Syria to India, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Russia, Portugal, and all of Central and South America, including the West Indies. I fell in love in a way that I probably would have never would working in a private suburban school that really didn't reflect the values that I was internalizing from my times at St. Vincent's Parish in Germantown, where at age 34, I first really learned what it meant to follow the 2 great commandments of God. So sometimes transformation occurs with an earth-shattering brilliance, the vision of a dove, the sight of the unfortunate, a word, a phrase, a movie, a book that completely changes our lives. Other times, the transformation unfolds like a peeling onion, layer after layer after layer, exposing our gradual awakening to something that really always existed, sometimes forever, without our ever seeing it or acknowledging it. For me, those 2 places, the School District of Philadelphia and St. Vincent's Parish, changed my life completely. So our first reading and the gospel have long been unpeeled onions, vacuum packed to prevent any possible combinations that produce differences in flavor, although that is what onions are supposed to do. On the surface, these readings seem pretty straightforward. God supports the status quo, which is the position of those writing the scripture passages we read today. And he, because this God is male, thrusts people he doesn't like out of office and summons his own servant, whom he endows with divine authority to do his bidding, which closely matches the bidding of the VIPs in power. And then all divine power comes to reside in this divinely chosen human being. The divine selectee is then given a key to which only he has access. And the bearded men reading this over the course of the millennia shook their gray heads in agreement. Indeed, this is how things work in heaven on earth, according to a divine plan. There are no subtle nuances or flavors here. The first reading is adroitly paired by another set of men who compiled the lectionary readings with the gospel, where Peter acknowledges Jesus as the Messiah, just in case the listeners didn't get the message about how divine privilege gets meted out. Peter, like Eliakim in the first reading, is rewarded with divinely conferred powers, given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and acknowledged as the rock upon which Jesus would build his church. This story made perfect sense to Christians for almost 2 millennia until women biblical scholars started to unravel it, peeling away the unfounded assumptions, exposing it to the air of diverse opinions and life experiences until it no longer makes any sense at all in our own time, especially since we know that Martha said the exact same thing and got, well, you know, nothing. What these readings do blatantly, I must say, in the year 2020, is to assert yet again the notion of caste that allegedly originated and is sustained by divine intention. The notion of caste has hamstrung the church since the 4th century, making it far less than it could have been. Caste, my friends, stinks to the high heavens, like rotting onion peels left at the bottom of a trash can on a hot summer day. Those who have the nose to sniff out the privilege of caste recognize what it is: garbage. The Catholic Church would deny that its actual framework is a caste system that they have no intention of dismantling. But like the Brahmin caste in India, the priestly caste has endowed itself with sacred power whose source lies in the shadowy past. To sustain the illogical premise of sacred power, the arbiters of the divine regularly select lectionary readings like those today as public proclamations to drive their point home to the faithful. Peter, with his plenitude of power, is their point man. Who can argue with the successor of the guy who got the keys to the kingdom of heaven? A caste system is bad enough when it forklifts the male gender into the image of God. It is also awful in a democracy where all citizens are supposed to be equal. As we see on the nightly news, caste determines who dies of COVID and who gets shot by the police. It determines who lives near the oil refineries spewing chemicals into the neighborhood's air and who is forced to drink publicly poisoned water. Caste allowed a ramp from I-95 to go right through the ball fields of my local playground when I was a kid. I recall my father asking an official if that would happen in Chestnut Hill. Well, you know what that answer would be. I mentioned last Sunday that I read Isabel Wilkerson's fine book, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents. And as I said in the announcements after Mass last week, I strongly, strongly advise everyone to read it. In brilliant prose, Wilkerson lays bare the harsh reality of caste that lies like a third rail under American society, electrified, but largely unseen unless one has eyes to see and understanding the reason why people got to be the way they are. Wilkerson describes caste as an invisible program, as the mudline of a house, or the unwritten rules of polite society that assign seats at the table or speaking parts in the boardroom. Caste endows the favored ones with the power to make decisions for others based upon opinion and appearance, rather than upon fact. Caste orders and directs. It takes advantage of the least among us. It rarely listens and rarely changes its mind, and it makes people into bullies. When one caste has a stranglehold on society, its unproductive and often evil nature commandeers society, warping it to fit their understanding of who is on top and why. It often blinds people to the source of its real power, which is nothing more than a fairy tale that they have woven into a spider web of privileges purportedly supported by God. This viewpoint tells only one story, allows no differing opinions, leaves no other options, and ultimately lacks imagination. And as a result, my friends, justice is turned back. Righteousness stands at a distance, and truth stumbles both in the public square and in the churches. The privileged caste will cry, peace, peace, when there can be no peace, as they continue to treat the wounds of their sisters and brothers shamelessly and heartlessly, their eyes blinded by the privilege of their unacknowledged caste. Caste also limits and misinterprets the power and the majesty of God, who will be what the divine will choose to be, regardless of what we think or believe. And that is all of humanity in its many manifestations, equally beloved and cherished by the God they all image. We forget this God at our peril and at the peril of the world. Leaving people out of the mix because of caste strangles good ideas, often closing off avenues that might have made the world a better place a long time ago. Caste is also sneaky and often hides not only behind pious platitudes, but also in the unconscious biases of those who would hotly deny prejudice. It has many manifestations, and sometimes you have to look really hard in order to see it. And so many privileged people would be aghast to find that their actions or their attitudes might be sexist or racist. So I'm going to give you two quick examples. We were at the beach last week, and a male family member got mad at me during a discussion. And so he exited the field of rational discussion and succumbed to yelling ad hominem attacks against me. I told him that calling people names rather than arguing facts is a failure in logic. I also told him that he was being disrespectful. Interestingly, two other male family members were sitting by my side, one of whom was a part of the discussion. His tirade was not directed against them. It was directed against me. And I often wonder if he would have done the same thing had I been a man. At Acme last week, I was standing in line at the deli. There was a white man standing in front of me who was being waited on, and off to the side was a white man who was being waited on and a black man who was standing right behind him. When the white deli slicer finished with the white customer, she proceeded to ignore the black man who was clearly next and just walked around fussing with things. Another deli worker came out, looked directly at me, and asked me if I were being served. And I pointed to the black man and I said, he was here before I was. When another white man walked up to the counter after the black man was served, the slicer who was fussing around the counter immediately stopped what she was doing and waited on him. Did the white deli worker deliberately ignore the black customer? Worse, did she even see him? I couldn't say. All I know, if I had been the worker and I had a couple little things to do, I would have said, I'll be with you in a sec, instead of ignoring him. So what do we do with this notion of caste and its many manifestations? First of all, we need to see it. We need to recognize it for what it is. And we have to unpeel it, as caustic as that might be to our tearing eyes. And while we are not responsible for the past, we are obliged to act in the present and to work against actions, laws, or decisions that actively harm our fellow human beings. Every unjust law in both church and state must be challenged. And Christians must ask themselves, how can I fix this? Or as John Lewis said, if you see something, do something. In the final paragraph of her book, Wilkerson offers a picture of a hopeful world, a world without caste. She wrote, in a world without caste, being male or female, light or dark, immigrant or native born, would have no bearing on what anyone was perceived as being capable of. In a world without caste, we would all be invested in the well-being of others in our species, if only for our own survival, and recognize that we are in need of one another more than we have led to believe. We would join forces with indigenous people around the world, raising the alarm as fires rage and glaciers melt. We would see that when others suffer, the collective human body is set back from the progression of our species. Friends, what Wilkerson is describing is the body of Christ in all of its splendor and its power. Let us try to open our eyes to its dazzling beauty. Let the scales fall from our eyes so that we can see the glory of our God shining in the faces of the least among us. Only then, as Wilkerson wrote, can we all be free.